I knew that as my channel grew, I would become more and more political in nature, using films as sorts of parables for larger ideas about the world. I think it's important to aim for the truth and make the world a better place for as long as we are here. But I don't think that's simply limited to the socio-political, environmental, and the artistic, but also making spiritual progress. Now, I could be best described as theist, in that, as of now, I hold the belief that there is something else out there beyond human understanding. I admit defeat that existence itself cannot truly be explained by humans, that existence is an absurdity. The only way to make sense of it is to put my faith into something else, something that, in many ways, has been rationalized for centuries by religions as a god or various gods. Science is good because it aims to make sense of the universe and redefine our previously held idea of God, what God is, what the universe as a whole is. But I think it also puts too much faith in humans, arguing that we can and we will understand the universe, but I think that's ultimately too naive. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Regardless, I think it is important to search for the truth, even if one's path leads them to start identifying as quote-unquote atheist. Atheism is not taking a passive or centrist perspective on one's own spiritual welfare, instead opting out to reject it altogether. At least that's atheism in the purest form. Of course, despite my own theological viewpoints, I am not without my deep criticisms of religions. The interesting thing about religions is that upon their establishment, they are often means of radically progressing society in more favorable ways. But as time goes on, they become corrupted and manipulated, and society in many ways moves past what the religion initially accommodated for. Conservatives then try to latch onto the past, not to preserve the religion so much as preserving their past sense of normalcy and comfort. Oftentimes they will remain completely defeated, and what they're aiming for is not a religiously dogmatic past, but instead the liberal status quo from 40 or so years ago. But the quote-unquote atheist should not act as if religious types stand out as hypocritical outliers, as couldn't be further from the truth. All ideologies, whether it be Christianity or even communism, are susceptible to endless revisions and corruptions at the hands of the people and institutions in power. China, for example, is often cited by the casual Western quote-unquote leftist as not being real communism, despite it making up a huge chunk of Earth's populations. A contemporary understanding and redefinition of this communist ideology that others insist does not reflect the true essence of what it should. And if we are to adopt this grossly reductive Western communist perspective on the matter of this blatantly godless society, atheism in a more true sense, we should also agree that it does not take a god for an ideology to be contorted to humankind's liking, for the pursuit and abuse of power to be something exclusive to religions, because that is not true. It couldn't be further from the truth. But that also doesn't mean that a society necessitates a god for its survival per se. I have my own personal beliefs on the matter, but I'd rather people come to terms with what they perceive to be the truth, rather than what is most convenient for them, what they're comfortable with, or what they want to be true. But after given sufficient reason to reject previously held dogmatic, political, or spiritual views, they do so in favor of the newly understood truth. Even if there is no objective right or wrong, it helps for people to form a moral framework of understanding, an established, collectively defined subjective view of good, enforced by what they believe to be objective truths. If there is more to the spiritual side of life, we ought to better understand it to the best of our ability, even if that means the ultimate rejection of it. And this is how I spent the first half of 2019 on my channel. I don't entirely buy into relative spirituality, but if I am to push for the conservation of theistic consideration, I ought to push for this type of relativism. This is ultimately what I was doing when talking about the Christian underpinnings of Stalker, or the spiritual relativism of possession, and then of course when I talked about the church-critical Passion of Joan of Arc. But something that predominantly white capitalist American Christians tend to lose sight of is their national and cultural solipsism, a rejection of other cultural perspectives. So I try to be conscious and mindful of the role of religions like Islam and Buddhism in contemporary culture, and understand the roots of ideas and how they flourish in different countries. So just as I would talk about Stalker, I'd also cover the Japanese film Jigoku, which pulled from a variety of different religious and mythological sources to establish a more universal understanding of hell. But that's not to say that hell is even something that religions, even within the same religion, all agree upon. But I would talk about Jigoku and apply a theological and moral reading of it because I felt that's the best way to approach such a film. How successful I am at using this platform as a means for propagating my ideological views through films, I am not sure, but I've been trying to figure it out. I noticed that the grand years of reactionary internet atheism have already come and gone, with content creators rejecting their obvious shallowness of the past and pushing instead for quote-unquote leftist activism, or the exact opposite, with many of them showing their true colors through their anti-SJW or anti-feminist rhetoric. Human rights was never their number one concern. And this is ultimately indicative in the natural progression of their previously held expression of shallow atheistic ideology. Of course, I ended up lessening my attention to theism as the year went on, instead focusing on political activism, recognizing grander political ideas in films by marginalized and impoverished communities. If we are to help the world, we should focus on the poor. In fact, I came to the realization that many people's standards for film in itself is classist. People scoff at films with smaller budgets as if quality is predicated on wealth, the financing behind the film. When you call a film cheap when it doesn't have a sizable budget, you may be contributing to a normalized contempt for the poor. You should be humble about these things. The way you approach the world and the way you approach art. You can appreciate aspects of the popular mainstream, but you should also consider what else is out there, made by marginalized communities in other countries and cultures. See, with my channel, I want to bridge the gap between the arbitrary distinctions of high art and low art, which is why I covered Watchmen by Zack Snyder, only to follow it up with Evolution of a Filipino Family by Law Diaz. If I am to eventually and effectively challenge the status quo in film circles, I must take such an approach, even if it's at the expense of confusing the algorithm and my own audiences. The second half of 2019 saw my channel become more feminist and class-conscious in nature, but I never abandoned my more theistic views in shaping the content of my uploads. When exploring antinatalism in Gaspar Noé's films, I would use it as an opportunity to voice my criticisms of both pro-life and pro-choice activism, something that's really difficult for me to choose from, while being the best moral person I can be. One of the issues with contemporary leftism is people insist on strict dogma that isn't even clearly defined. Some self-described leftists do have moral issues with abortion, but are too afraid to speak up about it in fear of contributing to the infringement of the rights of cis women and trans men. And pro-choice activists will downplay the opposition, which, quite honestly, for many, is less about control and more about concerns of infringing on the rights of children. Unborn children at that, but children nevertheless. Lives that were once considered sacred by many, that are now being disregarded as mere clumps of cells. For some, it is about controlling people, don't get me wrong, but that's not always the case. Certainly not for many people I have met. But at the same time, the quote-unquote right doesn't seem to recognize the actual arguments being proposed by the quote-unquote left. In many ways, abortion should be the rights of cis women and trans men. And if one is to get an abortion, I am certainly not one to judge. Personally, I can't help but see both sides of it. But by sitting on the fence, I'm ultimately in passive support of the pro-choice argument. But the ironic thing is, the more supposedly conservative stances I take have apparently leftist solutions. With abortion, the solution is proper sex education, mainstream criticism of rape culture, and LGBT and feminist activism. We ought to foster a society in which something like an abortion can be performed in a safe manner, if it must be performed at all. A society that allows people the freedom of choice and freedom of expression without infringing on the rights of others. Just because something doesn't always sit entirely right with you, does not mean it should not be a legal moral choice for others to make. Abortion is just one example, a contentious one at that. And as far as antinatalism goes, I'm not in favor in most cases. I think it's an interesting stance to take, and there are many reasons someone would take it, but there is often a misanthropic quality to it that's simultaneously classist, racist, and eco-fascist at its core, even if it's thought of as a radical leftist perspective. But as the days go by, I care less and less about being a good leftist and more about being a good person. Although I can't say I ever went through something like an anti-SJW phase, like so many others have, just a less nuanced and more critical period of relative bigotry, enforced not so much by my theistic influences, but instead by secular influences and conservative and neoliberal hypocrisies. So my way out was through my own theological and spiritual views. Theism is what led me to almost every single quote-unquote progressive political view, including my criticism of religions, of capitalism, and of contemporary conservatism, as well as my gradual personal distance from traditional masculinity, something that has been attributed to me arbitrarily and socially since birth. And it is theism that has brought me to mold my own moral framework to follow and live by, to accept and advocate for the rights of marginalized communities, while being critical of the status quo, which includes often dismissing the reductive nature of the political compass in favor of something more humanist and honest and true to life. Even if on occasion my language is a byproduct of the reductive and dogmatic social structures at large. Now, films are my artistic gateway to express these ideas, to express new ideas, to make attempts to understand the world better, and to bring something new to the lives of others on a political and spiritual level. Because ultimately, I want to try something new and more personal, yet at the same time tap into the innate desires humans long for, no matter how much they also dismiss it due to their own laziness and cultural elitism. Special thanks to my patrons, Yakovajanoy and George. Thanks for watching. This is Justin, or Jay, with Style as Substance.